Hello, I'm Mary Fitzgerald, the CEO of Eluna, welcoming you from the sleepy town of Philadelphia, where nothing newsworthy has happened over the last week. On behalf of all of us at Eluna, thank you for making the time to join us for our November community conversation, Let's Get Real About Grief. This is our 20th anniversary of serving children and families impacted by grief or addiction. Our free programs, Camp Erin and Camp Mariposa, have served over 40,000 children throughout 48 locations in the US and Canada. Our Eluna Resource Center has served over 200,000 visitors since 2016, but we know there is still a lot more work to do. That's why today we're so grateful for you to join us for this important conversation. Yesterday was Veterans Day. November is Children's Grief Awareness Month. And as we head into the holidays during a pandemic, we know that it's so vital for us to come together as a community to offer comfort, hope, and healing. So I'd like to thank our team for all the work they put into this event and for our sponsors for making it possible. To our founding sponsor, AmerisourceBergen Corporation, to our presenting sponsor, New York Life, Dwayne Morris, Charles and Debbie O'Donnell, Answering Service for Directors, Alchemies, the Bittenbender Corporation, the Walter Williams Foundation, M&T Bank, Diversified Search, and Penn Personalized Care, and Dr. Gary Dorsheimer. We thank you for your support. We're happy to be streaming this event on Facebook today, and our auction is live now. So please take a look in the chat or on Facebook and see if you can help support the programs that we're offering for children and families in North America. And now, it is my sincere pleasure to introduce you to an award-winning journalist and author whose work has appeared on ABC, NBC, PBS, in the Los Angeles Times, and on CNN.com. She has been the host of 2 documentary series on the E! Network that investigate topics such as teen suicide, challenges faced by military spouses, and youth subcultures in America. She's the host of the podcast Everyday Bravery, a series about finding courage during challenging times. She's also the host of the Discovery series, The Power of Kindness. In March of 2009, while reporting on the trafficking of North Korean women, Laura and her colleague Yuna were obtained by North Korean soldiers on the China border. They were arrested and held captive for 140 days. They received a special pardon and were able to return home to the US to be reunited with their families. She documented her experience in the 2010 memoir, Somewhere Inside, one sister's captivity in North Korea and the other's fight to bring her home, along with her sister Lisa. She was Glamour Magazine's 2009 Woman of the Year and has been awarded both an Emmy and an Edward R. Murrow Award. She's a service ambassador for Points of Light and resides in California with her husband Ian and her 2 children. I also hear she loves to partake in a family tradition of dressing up in costume to wish family members a very happy birthday. Please join me in welcoming the lovely and talented Laura Ling.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you. And thank you all for joining this discussion, this very important discussion about grief. As Mary mentioned, November is Children's Grief Awareness Month. And in the midst of a global pandemic, these are uniquely challenging times. With more than 240,000 COVID-related deaths in the US and more than 1.2 million around the world, I feel like we are all dealing with grief as a global community, which makes this discussion all the more relevant. Losing a loved one can be one of life's most difficult, confusing, and painful experiences, especially for children. And it's why the support that Eluna and Camp Erin and Camp Mariposa provide can be so instrumental in helping young people and families process grief in a healthy way. Dealing with our grief is something I think we don't talk about enough. which is why I feel so grateful to be facilitating this conversation today. And joining me is an incredible panel of guests. First, I would like to introduce Litsa Williams. Litsa is a licensed clinical social worker who is also the program director and co-founder of What's Your Grief, an online grief support community serving over 5 million visitors through its website, podcast, and social media following. Litsa's own personal grief experiences at a young age led her to want to help others. Welcome, Litsa.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Next, we have Reggie Simmons. Reggie is a former Camp Erin Philadelphia camper, which is hosted by Eluna's partner, Penn Wissahickon Hospice. He attended Camp Erin twice at ages 10 and 14. Reggie's sister died of brain cancer when he was just 10 years old, and his mother from breast cancer just 4 years later. Reggie is a 2019 graduate of Drexel University and has been a wonderful ambassador for Eluna. Thank you for being with us, Reggie.
Very happy to be here. Always happy to help out with stuff like this.
Thank you. Jennifer Traeger began working as a volunteer with Camp Erin in 2008 and became the director of Camp Erin Portland in 2011. She is also a licensed clinical social worker and manager of social work, bereavement, and volunteer community services for Providence Hospice. Hi, Jennifer.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Finally, we have Leslie Yabuki. Leslie is a mother of 3 children who attended Camp Erin Los Angeles, which is hosted by Eluna's partner organization, Our House Grief Support Center, of which Leslie is also a board member. Her children, now aged 12, 16, and 16, attended Camp Erin in 2018 after their father's passing. And Leslie has since become an outspoken advocate for grief support. Welcome, Leslie.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you to all of our panelists, Litsa, Reggie, Jennifer, and Leslie, for being a part of this important conversation. And I just want to remind our viewers out there, first of all, welcome. And we will have a few minutes at the end of our discussion for some questions. So please feel free to put them in the comment section. Litsa, let me just start with you. You lost your father when you were just 19 years old. How would you describe what natural and normal grief feels like compared to how our society may view grief or how we should grieve? And does someone's cause of death impact the kind of support one might give to someone who is grieving?
Wow, I think there's a lot in that question. I think that one of the things that we often want is an idea of what normal grief is or natural grief is, some sort of way that we can expect it and think it will look predictable in some way. And I think one of the things that's often the most difficult about grief is that it is so different for each of us. So grief is just our normal and natural reaction to a loss. And that reaction and response looks so different depending on the relationship you had with the person that died, your personality, your way of coping, your way of being in the world. And so part of, I think, understanding what normal or natural grief is knowing that what society expects, sometimes that there'll be stages or phases or a specific time frame, that often that isn't the case. It's going to be a little bit different for everyone. And I think that question about what the cause of someone's death was and how that might affect it, it's just one of the many, many things that may be part of how someone grieves. So I think a big part of how we provide people support and understand their grief is just to understand that each and every aspect of that person's life, that person's death, and the person who's grieving is going to come together for a unique experience of loss.
Thank you. Reggie, you were 14 years old when you lost your mom and 10 years old when your sister died. What was the best support or advice people gave you that allowed you to process your grief, and what wasn't so helpful?
I think that one of the most helpful things that the people in my life gave to me during that time, my family, my friends, teachers, and people like that, was that the way that I was processing this, no matter how different it was from what I thought it was supposed to be, was valid and okay. And that I shouldn't need to feel like I need to reach this certain milestone at this time, or that I need to feel this way at this time. I think the freedom that they gave me to really move through the process at my own pace and give me constant support and love and caring and generosity, that was extremely helpful. Things that weren't so helpful were, I didn't really encounter much of this, but if someone were to say that you should try and be a little bit more happy, you should try and seem a little bit more put together. It didn't happen to me much, but I could tell that sometimes people felt that way. And obviously that's a lot less helpful than being encouraging about the personal journey that I was taking.
Sure. And you attended Camp Erin twice. I understand that the first time you attended, you had some difficulty opening up, but the second time, really something made a difference. What was it that made a difference? And what did Camp Erin offer you that you might not have been able to get outside of that environment?
I think the first time that I attended, I wasn't nearly as open to expressing the feelings that I was having with the other campers and the counselors. But the second time around, I remember one night specifically, we were having a circle talk and we were all going around and sharing things that we felt. And I was encouraged by a counselor to, try and open up, try and say something that I'm kind of afraid to say or that I might not feel too comfortable talking about with other people. And that made all the difference, because once I opened up about something that I was feeling especially bad about, the support that I got and the advice and the words of wisdom from campers and counselors was extremely helpful in helping me to kind of move past this block that I was having in my own path to feeling better about, the stuff that I've been through. And I don't think I would have gotten that on my own.
Sure, I imagine being around others who were dealing with something similar was probably very helpful in allowing you to open up.
Absolutely, it was.
Leslie, after your husband passed, how did you balance processing your own grief while caring for your 3 children and allowing them the space to grieve? And what was your biggest concern for your children at that time?
That's the most difficult thing when you're going through this grief yourself. You're so overwhelmed and you can barely function at that point in time. And then I found that my children are so worried about me because I'm the surviving parent, and they seemed so healthy because they're trying to support me, making sure I'm okay. So that was really difficult. They also, we went to our house immediately within 3 months, because I was concerned about their mental health and grieving, because I don't think that I could support them as well as they needed to. And then I felt the counselors there were amazing, and they were with like situations. So it was really important. But I found that the hardest thing to do was help my children when you're grieving. You can, barely get out of bed or pay your bills or feed your kids. And so the support of our house was amazing.
Jennifer, what are some of the different ways adults and children process grief? And what are some signs that a child might be having a difficult time dealing with grief?
Yeah, I find it really helpful to think about grief. As Litsa said, it's that reaction to a loss, but it's not just an emotion, right? It's really something that happens in our total being. It's physical, it's emotional, it's in our thoughts. It can affect our sense of spirituality. It can affect our relationships. And, when we recognize that grief is showing up in all of those ways, it's important to know that it might look different for children. And that, I think, sometimes has led people to the mistaken assumption that children aren't grieving, or that they can't, be grieving because they don't understand what's happening. So what we know is that grief may just show up differently for children. It might be a more physical experience for them. They may be less likely to be able to verbalize what's happening, although that will be different for every child. Children might have a harder time understanding what's happened, and they may need to revisit it repeatedly over time, particularly as they develop new capacities, new abilities to understand what's happening. They're going to come back to that loss over and over again. And adults do that as well, but I think it's more dramatic for children, obviously, because they're changing so much over time. You know, I think for children and for adults, you know, we want to pay attention if there are really significant disruptions, for example, in someone's ability to sleep, or, you know, they're just not eating anymore. If we see things that concern us for their safety, you know, it's not uncommon for people to have thoughts or about, you know, wanting to die or wanting to be with the person who died. So it's very, very important to be tuned into those things and take them really seriously. I think sometimes too, children's grief is really misunderstood because it might show up as kind of this big energy, kind of a physical anxiety or need to move. And that sometimes is hard in a setting like a classroom, for example. Yeah.
Thank you. Those are important things for people to look out for. I think it's important to recognize how young people may be dealing with these emotions or feeling these emotions for the very first time. I remember losing my grandmother when I was in high school and my 14-year-old cousin just a few years later. And I distinctly remember that stabbing sensation in my heart, this feeling like I'd never experienced before. It was so raw and so deep. And being the child of immigrants who were so busy working and trying to put food on the table, I felt like there just wasn't that time or space for grieving. Litsa, I'll ask you this. I mean, what you talked about earlier about the stages of grief, and there really isn't any set pattern for grief. Can you talk about that a little bit more and sort of clear up any misconceptions about that and talk about how grief evolves over time?
Yeah, I think one of the things that, you know, lots of people know about the stages of grief, they've heard about them, and we always remind people that is one of so many different theories that exists about grief. And what we've learned in the many years since that idea of stages was put forward is really that grief kind of bounces all over the place for people. And I think people often think that we recover from grief like we recover from a cold, and we get a little bit better every day and then it goes away. And that's just not how grief works, right? What we know is that if grief is our natural reaction to a loss, we carry that loss with us forever. There's some ways that we will always be experiencing grief. It will just shift and change over time. And so we like to sort of help people to come from a place of not judging their own grief and knowing there's always going to be ups and downs. There's going to be good days and bad days. And our hope, I mean, a little bit to what Jennifer said, is we want to know that with time, we're starting to see maybe more good days starting to pop in among those bad days. We're being able to realize that we can start to create space where joy will live alongside of that loss that will always be there and that will always carry with us. And so I think that for many people, we can't give that roadmap that people want, that sort of predictable, it's going to look like this. But I think we can say that what we know is that we can carry our loss and our connections to our loved ones with us, and we can create space for new things that will come in the future. And that what we hope is to figure out the way that we'll be able to manage and balance that. And that's the trickiest part of grief. It's, you know, figuring out how to live with the pain and then the joy that we'll still be able to find as we move forward.
Thank you. Reggie, do you feel as though grief is always something that you will be dealing with in some capacity for the rest of your life? And how do you deal with subsequent grief that may be triggered by the loss of someone in your network or perhaps by a memory?
Yeah, I definitely do think that I will in some way be dealing with the grief from the losses that I've had for the rest of my life, but I don't think that necessarily means that it's going to weigh down on me significantly for the rest of my life. I mean, there are certain times during the year, there are certain activities that I'll do that remind me of memories that I've had with people that may make me a little bit sad. But I try to look at those not as reasons to be sad, but as reasons to appreciate the time that I have with those people before they left. But I think with time, it gets easier to do that, because at first, I mean, obviously, very soon after that happens, very soon after you lose someone or I lost someone, it's really difficult to look at those things and try and be happy. But I found that over time, it gets easier and easier, and it helps to have family and friends that can kind of give you advice, because that's a really important thing for me, being able to realize that I'm not alone in this, even though people's experiences may be different than mine. The feelings that I have are not really isolated only to me. Other people have dealt with these things, and looking at how they process this kind of stuff can be helpful too. And that definitely it's a large part of why it gets easier for me personally over time.
That's great, Reggie. I'm happy to hear that. And I think it's important to know that, as you and Litsa said, that joy can be found through this process and this journey at some point, and there can be some positive outcomes from dealing with your grief in a healthy way. Leslie, people always say, kids are so resilient, and of course they are, but why do you feel it's so important to provide the proper support for children who are grieving? And what did your kids get out of attending Camp Erin that they may not have otherwise?
Well, it's interesting. I spoke with my daughter about it last night, especially because I wanted to make sure I got her opinion on this. And she mentioned the most important part for her was being able to grieve at her own pace, and no one was forcing her to share feelings that she wasn't ready to share. And it made it open, and just this community of ease that it makes you open up your heart. And they taught her so many ways to channel her grief. And my daughter went 2 years. The first year, I think it was a learning experience. And the second year, I think she had grown so much that they said she was such a spokesperson for the new campers, and they loved her. They kept saying that she was this old soul. And I think that they had taught her so much from the first one, and she really wanted to go back every year and cannot wait till she's 18 and be a camper. But I think it was really nice how they had them write their emotions on these lights that they put on the water, and they send them out, and they brought them home, and I read them, and it was just amazing what they had written down that they had never spoken before. And it was so truly emotional and deep. It just broke my heart, but I thought they would have never done this alone or with me or anyone else. So there was these little moments there that I felt were so important for them to open up, even if they didn't share it with me. So those are some of the things I really enjoyed about Camp Erin.
Yeah, that's very powerful. And Jennifer, as camp director, you're experiencing these moments, on a daily basis. What are some of the long-term challenges that one might experience if he or she isn't able to deal with and process their grief? And what advice can you give to people in their adulthood who may have experienced trauma from the loss of a loved one in their youth, but weren't really able to process that grief?
Yeah, it's really striking how often we'll hear from adults who experienced a significant loss in childhood that they really felt that their loss was unacknowledged or unseen, and how often adults will say to me, I wish I could come to Camp Erin. So I think this sort of ability to face grief, to learn how to tolerate it, to learn, as you all have described, how to still find joy in our lives. It's almost like building a muscle, right? And that learning those skills and abilities to kind of tolerate the difficult emotions of grief, to build connections with other people and relationships, to figure out how to comfortably ask for help when you need it. Those skills are so helpful to us in the rest of our lives, right? And, we all know that loss happens over our lifetimes, whether it's through death or other circumstances. And so, developing that sort of confidence in yourself too, that like, hey, I can get through this. It's just helpful, I think, in all other parts of life. And I really believe that it's not too late ever to give yourself the space and the time and to get the support that you need to address a loss that perhaps you did not have the opportunity to do in your younger life for whatever reason. So I really encourage people, if that is your circumstance, don't hesitate to reach out and to find that community that can help you with that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would love to attend a camp, Erin, for adults. So maybe there's another camp that you guys need to start down the line. I think it could be extremely helpful. I think for people who are wanting to support others who are grieving, often there's a very general response, which is, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for your loss. I guess I pose this to anyone who wants to answer this question. Is that okay? And what other suggestions do you have to bring comfort to others, and especially children who are grieving?
I can attack this first.
Please, Reggie.
Yeah, sure. I think that saying I'm sorry, I can't speak for everyone, but I heard that a lot, and I think it's definitely okay. And although it's not everything you need to hear, it's people mean well. That was my feeling when I heard that. And I think that more importantly than saying I'm sorry is, after the fact, being available for the person who's grieving in a way that maybe you don't know how to be yet, but being open to hearing from them and letting them talk to you about things that they need to talk about. And they may not know how to do that yet, but I think the most important thing, for me at least, was that availability down the line, because me especially, I wasn't really able to talk about my grief and other feelings I was having right at first. It took a little while. And I think being sorry and saying I'm sorry is a wonderful start for that. And I think that's, I think it's a nice thing. It's a nice sentiment.
Well, sometimes there is that awkwardness, right, when it comes to offering support to those who are grieving, especially those that might not be extremely close to us, but we still want to reach out to them. We might not know the appropriate thing to say, or we're nervous about upsetting them even more. Litsa, what advice would you give to someone who wants to help but doesn't know how? And are there certain boundaries that we should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. I think sometimes our fear of even what you just described, our worry about that we're going to upset the person more, will then cause people to retreat and think, oh, I better give them space, or I don't want to say the wrong thing. And all of a sudden that fear, it can be what leaves people feeling that people abandoned them or disappeared or didn't check in. So I think remembering that being there for someone is always the most important thing, and knowing that you might get it wrong, you might say the wrong thing sometimes, and that's okay. To be able to just be open and communicate that and say, like, I'm struggling, I'm having a hard time, I don't know exactly what you need or what to say, but I want you to know that I'm here, goes such a long way. And I think one of the other things that we always remind people is your job is not to fix what this person who you love and care about is going through. This is the most devastating thing often that could have happened to them. And so we often want to comfort people, I think, because we want to take away their suffering. We don't like to see them in pain. And I think one of the things that at What's Your Grief, we try to remind people all the time is like, just be there to support people. It's not about comforting them. It's not about, making them feel better. It's about saying, I'm here to support you through whatever you're feeling and whatever you're going through, I'm going to be able to be present. And that will vary in degrees depending on how close or not close you are with the person. If it's the neighbor down the street you don't know that well, or if it's, your dearest friend, what that support looks like might vary. But I think sometimes remembering that our job isn't going to be to take away the pain can ease some of that feeling that we need to find the perfect words that can sometimes get in the way.
I also,
yes, please.
Can I chime in really quick? I also agree with that. It's nice when people say they're sorry, and I totally agree with that. But I found that really resonated with me were the few people that would come up to me and say, "How are you?" and sit and just listen. And you could tell the people that were genuine, and even if they didn't say anything, just listen and know that they cared. And that's really all that it was. It's just to know that someone was there for you. I think that's the most important thing. But I agree with it. Everybody wants to make you happy and solve your problems, but just really being there and being genuine. How are you? How's your day? That's so important.
That can make a difference. And that can happen virtually, right? I mean, we're heading into the holiday season during a global pandemic, and it can feel particularly isolating. And we might not be able to be with that person who is grieving in person. Do you all have any advice about how we can support them virtually?
I think it's, go ahead, Leslie.
No, go ahead.
Well, I just was going to say, I think it's so helpful, first of all, to just acknowledge like it's different, right? I think sometimes what I hear from families is that half the battle is just trying to pretend that everything's the same when in fact nothing feels the same anymore. I think we're all having an experience of that this year, but that's really can be, very difficult for families. And if possible, just really by acknowledging that, it opens up an opportunity to talk about, well, what's important to hold on to that has been a tradition, what just feels totally overwhelming this year. I can't, even think about doing that. And also, how can we incorporate this person into what we're doing? How can we acknowledge and keep alive the memory, the bond that we have with this person who's died? And there's so many different ways to do that.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah.
I want to take a few questions from our viewers. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. We have a question from Robin, and that is, how would you be there for kids at 5 years old?
I think there's a lot. This is a big question. It depends on every 5-year-old. It's a little different, right? But I think one thing for kids that we like to remind people in general is just helping kids to normalize that feelings are okay. Whatever the feelings aren't good or bad feelings, they just are. And, what we do with the feelings, it's important to look at, but helping kids know, especially right now, as we're just talking about the holidays and when kids are seeing people around them, adults being sad and sometimes not knowing how to make sense of that being able to help kids to just understand a little bit more about feelings and understand that they're going to have moments that they're really, really, really sad. And then 5 minutes later, they might be really, really happy. The holiday season this year is probably going to have lots of really sad moments and lots of really happy moments, and that's okay. Because I think that's there's so many things you can do for kids. I'm sure others have ideas, but I think just helping with the very confusing experience of the emotions that they're feeling and the emotions they're seeing, and giving them permission for all of those feelings is really important.
Leslie, do you have any comments as a mom who had young children who were grieving?
Yeah, what I have found is I always try to bring up their father and bring up stories, great stories that they didn't know because they were so young when he passed away, and tried to, oh, your dad cooked this, or we did that, or to me, like, make it a happy, I try to bring the happy memories in for them. And then I've also known people that have done memory books and memory walls, and on the date of the death or their birthday, they have all their pictures up and, you know, talk about the times. I find that really helpful because I don't want to remember them sad. I want to remember them happy and this great person that they were. And I try to instill, oh yeah, just things that they do that remind me of their dad, I don't know, to try to make them happy and love, not to feel the sadness all the time.
That's beautiful advice. We have another question from Lauren, which is, would one of you also talk about how 5-year-olds need help understanding causality?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm happy to take a stab at that. I think you know, death is such a hard thing to understand, even for us adults. It's very abstract in some ways, and children are often more concrete. And so, and I think it's, you know, even just the idea that death is permanent, for example, that the person's not coming back, or, you know, that we all will die one day, the universality, those aren't things that we just know automatically. And so it is really, I think, normal and helpful for kids to wrestle with that, to want to talk about, well, how do people die? Why do they die? What caused the person to die? Our tendency, very understandably, is to want to protect, but the risk that we take by not giving children information about death is that they're so creative and they'll fill in the blanks with their own understanding about what's happened. And unfortunately, sometimes that's wrong information, and may even, you know, sometimes we'll see kids, for example, believe that they did something to cause a death when of course it had absolutely nothing to do with them. So I do think, you know, finding the language that you're comfortable with to talk about what happened, how it happened, letting kids draw pictures, you know, answering their questions, sometimes answering the same questions over and over again. This can sometimes present a situation for parents where the child's needs are kind of a mismatch with what they might feel like they need. I remember talking with a mom who had pretty young sons who just said, you know, I know they need to talk about how their dad died over and over again, but it's really painful for me. So those might be situations where having that other outlet, like a support group or even another caring adult in the child's life, can be really helpful. So I hope that's helpful to Lauren.
Great advice, Jennifer. And we are just almost about out of time, but I'd just like to pose a question to each of you, if you could answer quickly. And that is, what would you say is one of the more powerful tools when it comes to processing our own grief? Or do you have any final words of advice? Jennifer, why don't I start with you?
Okay, let's see. I think one of the powerful tools that I see with children that adults can use with children is reflection. So really being with kids as they play, as they express, and not feeling like you have to answer or fix things for them, but really just kind of in a very present way, mirroring back to them what they're experiencing. It really often has the effect of very much kind of opening up the conversation with kids. So I recommend it.
Great, thank you, Jennifer. Leslie, any advice?
For me, when the wave of grief comes, I just try to, you know, flow through it with them, you know, because something can hit you at that moment and you can feel it. But I just try to feel it personally and have my kids feel it, just and talk about it, and it's normal and it's all okay, and just to be there with them. I think that's really helpful.
Litsa?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll give one that I think is really specific, but for me has been really important. And that's that I've used photography as a tool for coping with grief personally throughout my own losses in my life. And it's a work that we do with What's Your Grief with people. And one thing I think that's important is that the history of mental health and grief support, it's been very focused on talking for a long time, and talking isn't always for everyone. So for kids, play and art is and can be so important. For me, certainly as a teenager and then as into adulthood, photography has allowed me a way to process emotions, to think about my connection with people who've died, and to do all of that without words, which has been really important for my grief.
Thank you. And Reggie?
Yeah, absolutely. I think if I can give one piece of advice, and this one comes from personal experience, it's that if there's something that's bothering you related to grief or related to someone you've lost, something that bothers you so much that you feel like you can't tell anyone, I've found that most of the time that's the most important thing for you to tell someone, because it can be a huge block to kind of progressing through your journey of feeling better and getting better. So my advice would be to be open to talking about stuff like that.
Thank you all so much. Reflection, flowing through just being there, photography or another creative outlet, and just being open. Those are such wonderful words of advice. I want to thank you all for sharing your stories and these words of wisdom about something that is so deeply personal, but something that most of us will be confronted with at some point in our lives, right? Grieving the loss of a loved one, which can be especially difficult for children and young adults. Over the past year, this pandemic has shown an even larger spotlight on grief, as well as serving as a reminder that we are all in this together. We are not alone, and that our support of each other is what will get us through. So thank you all so much, so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And it's just such incredible, valuable, genuine advice. Thank you to Litsa, Reg, Jennifer, Leslie. Really, I've learned so much today. Just your openness and honesty, and self-reflection on not only how we can process our grief in our own time and space, but how we can support those who are grieving. So we're so grateful, especially knowing that sharing these personal experiences is certainly not easy. It takes courage and determination. And Laura, you have certainly been incredibly courageous in sharing your experiences and your fears of whether you would ever see your family again. And as we heard today, traditions and rituals are just such a very special part of healing, and certainly are special to us at Camp Erin. So one thing I found remarkable in reading your book, that was while you were held captive in North Korea, you started a daily gratitude practice. So I hope, if you are okay, would you mind sharing with our audience why this was so important to you?
Yeah, I mean, of course, as you mentioned, when I was held in captivity, I didn't know that if I would ever see my family or my loved ones ever again. So I think I was sort of grieving in that way. And so I started practicing the ritual of gratitude. It became a ritual for me. And what I did was every night before I went to sleep, I would sit and I would think about something or some things that happened in that day that I felt grateful for. So even though I was experiencing the most traumatic experience of my life, I tried to find small things. For example, I would say, today, my guard sort of made a joke and we shared a small laugh, even though that guard is normally very mean and aggressive. Or today I saw a butterfly outside my window, even though I'm not allowed to even breathe the fresh air outside. And so I would focus on these small things, and it helped me get through to the next day. It helped me find hope. And it's something that I actually do to this day, because I find that it can bring a greater sense of meaning and purpose to my life. And so that was the ritual I practiced, I think, in a similar way that Litsa, photography brings some comfort to her. And I would encourage people to search for their own rituals that they can practice on a regular basis. And so in keeping with my ritual of gratitude, I will, before I go to sleep tonight, I will express my gratitude for being able to be a part of this discussion today.
Well, thank you. We are certainly grateful, and what a way in the month of November with Thanksgiving to end the panel. So thank you. And if you have not read Laura and Lisa's book, I highly encourage you to make time to do so, because certainly makes us all grateful in reading your story. And thank you for sharing that with us. Thank you all, everyone again on our panel, for bravely sharing your stories, and for everyone today. I hope you have found this conversation as moving as I have. And, you know, now more than ever, we really could use your support to make sure we can continue to help supporting grieving children and families. If you can, please make a donation. There's a link in the chat or on Facebook or at elunanetwork.org. Our auction is still live and will be going on through tomorrow. And any support is always welcome. And if we can support you or your loved ones in any way, please do not hesitate to reach out to us. Or if you'd like to get involved with our programs as a volunteer or a Young Professionals Committee, we would love to talk to you. So thank you again to our wonderful partners, Providence Hospice in Portland, Our House in LA, and What's Your Grief for this impactful conversation. And please connect with us on social media, and let's keep the conversation going using the hashtag #AskEluna. And I ask you to keep all of the grieving children on top of your minds this November and Children's Grief Awareness Month, and reach out to someone that you know would just want to hear how you're doing. Thank you so much.